Session 6. Our topic is Jesus, Mary and Martha and Lazarus as we journey with John through Lent. So here we are in chapter 11, having started in chapter 3 in Jerusalem with Nicodemus in conversation with Jesus, traveling north to Samaria, where Jesus meets a woman by the well, coming back to Jerusalem. We skip over the scenes that are told in chapters 5 to 8. And last week we were in Jerusalem with the whole dramatic saga unfolding relating to the healing of a blind man. That scene continues on right through to the end of chapter 10. And we pick up today in chapter 11, where Jesus has gone just outside of the city of Jerusalem, just a few kilometers, to Bethany, where he encounters Mary and Martha and a crowd of mourners. Well, actually, it starts in Jerusalem. We're not quite in Bethany at the beginning of the story, but we're certainly there for most of it. This is the seventh sign performed by Jesus in John's Gospel. On the top right, you can see the list of signs. You also have these in your resource notes. Jesus performed 2 signs in Galilee, then in Jerusalem, and then 2 more one beside the Sea of Galilee, one on the Sea of Galilee, walking on the water, then back in Jerusalem, and now in Bethany. So the raising of Lazarus, the coming out from the tomb of Lazarus, is the 7th of the 7 signs. Not that John makes that point, but I think we're intended to understand that as the drama rolls along through the first half of the gospel. It's also, for this gospel, the climactic moment in the developing plot when the Jewish authorities determined to move against Jesus. Next week, we will look at what follows in John's Gospel in chapter 12, and that one of the stories there, the entry of Jesus into Jerusalem, is really the definitive moment in the synoptic Gospels, crystallizing the plot against Jesus. But in John's Gospel, that plot already happens before he enters Jerusalem, as the Jewish authorities from that day on plan to put him to death. That's how the story ends. So you will have seen in your resource material that, again, this story is a drama, an unfolding drama with points of tension, conflict, sudden awareness, and the very dramatic event at the tomb of Lazarus, which isn't the close of the story, because the story moves on, as this chart indicates, through to the response of the authorities in Jerusalem, and then Jesus leaving Bethany and going back to Jerusalem. So we're going to be looking at this drama in blocks, dealing with different scenes in order as they come, and picking up some of the issues that we find in those scenes. So we start when Jesus, still in Jerusalem, receives a message from Bethany that the one whom he loves is ill, from the sisters of Lazarus. And then Jesus has a very interesting comment. So the predicament that Mary and Martha face is Lazarus is the only male in the household. And in the culture, a woman without a man would be profoundly vulnerable to poverty. So Lazarus is, in a sense, the social security for Mary and Martha, as well as being a beloved brother. So they send word to Jesus. They call on him for help. And as noted in your notes, the word Lazarus means God helps. So there's a nice play there. Jesus is a friend of Lazarus, so Mary and Martha expect Jesus to behave in a manner in keeping with the society in which they live, but Jesus doesn't. So a few questions for us we'll toss around, I think, in the large group. What does Jesus fail to do, and what, if any, are the implications of this as we enter into this passage? How does it help us understand what is to come?
Well, Jesus fails to stop what he was doing and go straight to them.
He fails to do that. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, he does. In fact, he deliberately says, "Oh, we'll just hang around for a few more days."
Yes.
For me, that would come as a cost in my local ministry if I delay go and visit. That will cost probably a few relationships, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point, Otto. In ministry, if someone asks you to do something because it's urgent and you take your time getting to it, it's not usually well regarded.
Yeah.
Particularly if you're not doing something at least equally urgent that stops you. And
Yes.
he wasn't. He was sort of hanging out with the people wherever he was.
Yes, he was just hanging out. He wasn't doing anything, as John records it, particularly important.
Well, in Jesus' defense, he's just had this long series of very torrid conversations with the Jewish authorities. Probably needs a bit of time out to recover.
It's a bit of a leg down from where they were, presumably Jerusalem, down to the Jordan. So he's really making a bolt for it. But I'm wondering, John or Elizabeth, if you could just explain what's behind phrase, "This illness does not lead to death." Like, on the face of it, that could be just saying, "Oh, Lazarus is not going to die," but to suggest there's some sort of deeper theology behind it. It eludes me.
It probably needs to be put in the context of what he says a couple of verses later, where he says that Lazarus is, like he said, the blind man, it's going to be something to the glory of God. That's not the exact words because I don't have the text in front of me. But he makes the point to the disciples that this is going to be the big thing that points to the sign that he is when it happens. And I think it belongs in that context.
Margaret, muted.
Margaret, you're muted.
Having all sorts of trouble this morning, even getting online, so I'm not surprised. But we're making an assumption here that these are words of Jesus and not a construct of John, putting things around so that he gets the story the way he wants to tell it.
We're not really making that assumption, are we?
Well, I was making that assumption that it's a story.
Yeah.
So I think,
And as John's gospel goes on, we see later in chapter 12, but particularly in chapter 17, that the idea of Jesus' death is the moment of his glorification, and in his death he is glorifying the Father. So these things are done for God's, it's done to lead to God's glory, that the Son of Man may be glorified through it. Is very Johannine. That's John's purpose. Yeah.
I've got the text in front of me now, and it is that this illness does not lead to death. It's for God's glory. So like he's going to heal the blind man for God's glory, Lazarus is going to be, I don't think raised is quite the right word in this context, because that's not what John uses later on in the story, but Lazarus will be brought back to life. So God will be glorified through this wondrous sign.
Doing this wondrous sign for God's glory is completely out of character with Jesus. Most often, Jesus acts out of compassion. He has compassion on the suffering people that he sees. So he surely this time he's having compassion on his two great friends, Mary and Martha, and also their brother Lazarus. Surely it's compassion that's prompting him not to give glory to God. So I would suggest they're words that John's put in Jesus's mouth.
Well, there's not a lot of compassion in John's gospel. Let's be clear about that. It's not a word John uses. It's the synoptics that talk about Jesus being compassionate, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And this is and John uses this to glorify God quite a bit. So as John said, this John that you can see, not the writer of the gospel, is right when he says about this is a Johannine theme.
Can't we take a global view of it, putting all of
No, Ian, we cannot. We cannot harmonise John with the synoptics, and we're not even going to attempt it because that is blasphemous.
That's why there's signs.
The thing that I have in front of me suggests that the translation, a possible translation of the Greek is, this illness is not meant to end in death.
It's thanatos, it's death.
Yeah, but
I've
it's
got the
not.
Greek in front of me.
The translation is it's not meant to end in death, but
Oh, I see.
which is
Prosthanaton, so it's towards death. Yeah,
It's towards death. Yeah,
so death as the end result. Yeah.
yeah. It doesn't actually have a word. It's just dative preposition.
yes.
No, it's pros with pros with the accusative. It's prosthanaton.
Oh, it's accusative. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Anyway,
But yeah,
Excuse us while we have our Greek lesson.
that's right. But it's just the verb to be followed by the preposition and the noun. So there's not another word in there. So you could interpret it that way.
yeah.
So John has introduced this with a highly interpretative theological explanation already. And also there's the two levels. We've seen the misunderstanding in John's gospel before. So this illness looks like it's going to lead to death. That would be the natural human thing to say. He's so severely ill that he's surely will die. And Jesus says, no, that's not the purpose of all of it. There's a deeper purpose to it. So it's Jesus again diving down to a deeper level.
And then he hangs around another 2 days just to make sure Lazarus is dead when he finally gets there.
Let's press on to the next question, because we've got in scenes 2 and 3 Jesus debating with his disciples about whether to go. And I love this verse from Thomas. Thomas says, no, come on, we've got to go there. Let's go also that we may die with him. It's the firebrand Thomas. A different insight into Thomas from what we get in chapter 20, the doubting Thomas, which is the dominant Thomas the twin said, let's go that we may die with him. But anyway, Jesus gets there, and the encounter between Jesus and Martha in verses 17 to 27 is very interesting. So we thought that we'd invite you to think about Martha before we get to Mary and then Lazarus in the story. How would Martha's conduct as she came out and challenged Jesus, how would Martha's conduct be viewed? What do you think about what Jesus says in reply to Martha? That's in verses 23 and then 25. And then what are the cultural elements that are important to understanding this story that I probably touched on already earlier in earlier comments?
Okay, how did you go with how Martha was behaving herself? And
well, we decided that nothing much has changed in regards to the women's impending poverty without a breadwinner in the family.
Without a breadwinner, yeah. Yes,
I think Martha was
cultural element.
I think Martha was behaving out of character for a woman at that time in that society, going and ticking off Jesus for not coming earlier.
Yes, she is behaving quite out of what you'd expect for the women of that time.
Yeah, and we thought that was in character with Martha herself anyway, in the way her story has unfolded in the gospel. She's the one that challenged Jesus over the, is it right to sit at his feet and all the rest of it. So, so we thought it was in character with Martha to be progressive, I think, as somebody said.
Me.
Yep.
Yeah.
Do remember that story of Martha and Mary, where Martha's doing the housework and Mary's at Jesus' feet, is in the Gospel of Luke.
Luke. So I'm sorry, we shouldn't have said that, but we did.
We did too.
So Martha is being a bit feisty for the day, isn't she? She's not demurely waiting at the home. She's not with a male escort. She's come out and said, "Where were you?"
Yeah.
So imagine her wagging her finger at him.
Well, she may well have done.
I've got a problem with this. We are going down the track of saying this is a literary and theological
Yes.
construct of,
Yep.
of the gospel writing. We've agreed on that. Can we be sure that any of the characters who appear in the story, Martha, Mary, Lazarus, they actually existed? Were they historical figures? What's their historicity? The other thing about them is, can we believe that the words attributed to them, they actually said? And indeed,
That's right.
we even say that about Jesus. Can we say that any words attributed to Jesus in the Gospels were words that he verbatim said?
Well, I've answered that question for you at least twice, Ian, about how we determine what Jesus may and may not have said. So I don't know I need to go over that again. And I think that this is asking the wrong questions. John has done this story for a reason. It is a theological reason, and we're going to miss the point if we get hung up about its historicity and about, did Jesus really say this, and did Martha or Mary really do that? The whole story is a theological treatise, if you like, about this ultimate sign that God is doing through Jesus. And that is what I think we need to focus on, because that is what John wants us to focus on, and not go down rabbit holes about who said what and whether or not we can prove it, because the short answer is we can't. And this particular story is only found in the Gospel of John. It's not mentioned in the Synoptics, which means that it's got to have a bit of a question mark over it, because one would think if Jesus did this, that Luke, Matthew and Mark might have noticed it and heard about it as well. But I think that is to miss the point of what John is trying to tell us.
Can we be sure that when Martha spoke to Jesus that she was angry? I could see that it wasn't the cultural thing to do, and I could see that for women to go out and do that unescorted wouldn't be the thing to do. But are we sure that it's an angry? What if she was grief-stricken, or are we putting a construct on that?
It's possible, but she's come out. She's actually acting in quite an impetuous way, and she's really being accusatory, I think, when she says, if you had been here, he would not have died. She doesn't say, thank God you're here to mourn with us. She says, if you had come earlier, he would still be alive.
It's almost as if she's putting the blame on Jesus because Lazarus has died.
Yeah.
That's the way we traditionally read it, but we have no way of knowing
No.
she has no way of knowing how long it took the messenger to actually find Jesus. So it may have just been, if you'd been here, he wouldn't have died, but now we're in this awful mess, rather than if you'd come faster. I don't know how important that is, but
given that Jesus has deliberately hung around and delayed it, I think within that context, it's reasonable to read it as Martha is rather upset he didn't get there quicker. If you look at it, if you want to read it in a flat historical way and find all sorts of logical reasons about why he couldn't have come earlier, I think it misses the point of what John has told us.
But the next verse, she says that I know, but even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him. So is there hope? Is that saying that, you can still do something for him? Or has she thought that he's dead and is gone?
Well, it's an interesting question that she's a comment that she's making there. And Jesus replies by saying, your brother will rise again. But Martha, in typical Johannine fashion, misunderstands him and says, I know he will rise again on the last day in resurrection.
Yeah. But because that's why when she said that to him, I would have thought that she would have had, you know, hope that Jesus will do something.
Well, maybe she does. Yeah.
I think it was a reactionary response.
Yes. And Mary is going to do the identical thing. When Martha sends for her and says that, you know, he wants you. Martha comes and says the identical words.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, Mary says the identical words that Martha does. So what about Jesus' reply to Martha? What did you think of that?
To me, it, even as something as a literary exposition, it's not very convincing. Here is Martha saying, look, if you'd been here, you could have saved him, he wouldn't have died. And then he makes a major theological pronouncement, one of the greatest in the whole of the New Testament. Lo, I am the resurrection and the life. To me, it seems a rather incongruous way to reply to a friend's great concern.
Yes, it is not normally the way you talk to a bereaved person.
Especially not if you're, you know, supposedly a young Jewish man wandering on the road back to face these angry women. So, you know, it's a pretty unusual sort of response.
It is. And then as now,
bedside manner.
I mean, it's not a good bedside matter. And then as now, if someone's bereaved, you'd probably say, I'm sorry for your loss. You would weep with them. You would attempt to console them. Jesus is not in that cultural role at all.
No. And they would have been surrounded, as I read, by, you know, the ones that had come to console them because of the brother having died. You would have expected Jesus just to join in with the weeping and wailing that would have been carrying on.
That would have been the normal cultural expectation, that he's come to offer them consolation and he would join in that lament for Lazarus. And of course he doesn't. As Ian says, he makes this amazing pronouncement that I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die.
Yeah. And so there's another one of these Johannine's I am statements. It's the last and the biggest one.
Yeah, and it's a very, as you say, it's a very important one at this side. Then he asked Martha, of course, do you believe this? So he's having a theological debate with Martha rather than giving her consolation and sympathy. But she says, I believe you are the Messiah. So here we have a woman, the second woman in the Gospel of John, making this confession about Jesus. You are the Son of God, the one coming into the world.
And that's interesting because in the synoptics, in Mark 9 and parallels, it is Simon Peter who makes that pinnacle confession. And in the structure of if we think about the structures of the gospel, that in the theological structure of Mark, that's kind of like the high point. God has already declared at the baptism that Jesus is Son of God in Mark, etc. But it's that recognition, you are the Son of the living God, is made by Simon Peter in Mark, Matthew, and Luke. That same confession, Simon Peter makes a confession in chapter 6 in John's Gospel, you are the Holy One of God. But that same classic confession, you are the Son of God, is made by Martha at this point. And so Martha makes that confession, and the Samaritan woman gets her villagers to say, this is the Saviour of the world.
Yes.
Effective
John
female
likes these
discipleship.
feisty women. We like the feisty women of John.
John
they're not
also
found in the
writes very
synoptics.
bad dialogue. I mean, he you have to suspect that he leaves out the great bits of it that he doesn't consider are important and just gives you the highlights, because it's often full of non sequiturs.
Yes.
That's if you're writing.
It's interesting that Martha, who was there doing all the work, is the one who has come forward to comment.
Remember that Martha does the work in the Gospel of Luke, Patricia. She's
Yes.
not doing all the work in the Gospel of John. We have no idea what she was doing. We just know she's probably the older sister.
Yes. So she's sort of taking responsibility.
She is. She's taking charge, if you like. Bill, you were going to say something.
Well, we keep going back to as if this is somebody writing a series of historical things rather than it's almost like a piece of theatre.
It is.
If you're writing a play, you give people these high-sounding statements and deeper, meaningful things to say, which in ordinary contexts and conversations just don't happen. But if you're writing a play and a bit of theatre, then you're making a point. And I think in all these words, they're laden with meaning because John is constructing this theological statement or series of statements.
Yes, he is. But he's also making a point by how he has people behave in the play. Martha is not behaving like a typical first century female. And the fact that those words are on her lips is important.
It's a bit like Taming of the Shrew with Shakespeare.
I don't know Martha's being tamed here. In fact,
No,
I rather
but
think
she's starting
being,
out.
she's breaking out in some ways.
Yeah.
But it's significant that in the Gospel of John that these two big confessions we have are from women. That is a deliberate construction on the part of the writer of the Gospel. So it's not about whether they historically did this. It's the fact John puts those words on their lips, and it's saying something about John, and it's saying something about how John views women.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to say. It's obviously then really important in the Johann community that the women in the story are affirmed, so that you'd have to then say so that he's affirming the women in his community for whom he's writing.
Yeah, and I'd agree with that, Margaret. If we apply social scientific methodology to this, the fact that John affirms women a number of times suggests that women are in leadership positions in his community.
In his community, yeah. So he's writing for his, I mean, that's another thing we need, I think, to remember. He's not actually writing for us. He's writing for his community. We're reading thousands of years later what he wrote. And the purpose for his writing seems, if we look at it like this, he is affirming the leadership of his community.
Yeah.
And
yes,
it's another
that's
woman
right.
that he appears to first as a resurrected Jesus, Mary Magdalene.
Yes, another Mary. That's right.
Yeah.
So women are immensely important in the Gospel of John, and to me, that's the saving grace of the Gospel of John. John's feisty and unusual women. Even the woman caught in adultery, we're not sure quite where she comes from, but she's been posted into the Gospel of John. And even the way she is treated and what happens there is such an interesting story. So these women are important, and they're symbols themselves in some ways. All right. Shall we move on to looking at comparing with the other passages that we have looked at before? So we've looked at the Samaritan woman, we've had conversations with Nicodemus at night, and we've had the Pharisees and the family and the man born blind. All of those stories were stuffed with Johannine symbols. So what we want you to do in your groups now is have a look at what symbols were in those stories, if you can remember, and what other symbols do you think are important in this story about Lazarus, Martha, and Mary? Is there similarities and contrasts you can find? And also, John's given you some hints, but see if you can spot the irony in this story, because John is being incredibly ironic in parts of this story. So there is your challenge in your groups. Well, how did you go with this, you're comparing?
Elizabeth, can we talk about the ironies Matt pointed to what I hadn't realised before, but what perhaps one of the greatest irony of the whole chapter is right at the end, where Caiaphas and his pals start plotting the murder of Jesus. Here we have the high priest, the head of Judaism, plotting beforehand to do murder. In our own day and age, it would be similar if the Pope Francis, started getting rid of rivals and started plotting to have the Archbishop of Canterbury murdered. It's a shocking.
Or vice versa.
And is it one of the intended ironies, or am I reading too much into it?
I don't think that's one of the intended ironies, that the high priest is acting with violence in the 1st century. However, you are quite correct saying there is irony attached to the high priest. When he says it is better to have one man die for the people than have the whole nation destroyed, that's incredibly ironic, because of course one man is going to die for all the people. And we as the readers know that, and John's listeners in the community know that. But Caiaphas is saying what is true, but he's saying it in a completely different context. So that is indeed very ironic.
So you've got the chief priest presaging the core of Christian theology. One man is going to die to redeem humanity.
That is the irony of that statement. Not that he's plotting violence, but yes, he's actually making this true statement with no idea what he's saying. And his intention, of course, is quite different. So if we're going to be on irony for the moment, where else is the irony in the gospel, in this passage, that you could find? Because there is one big one, and John's given you a hint.
Well, I wondered whether there was irony in the fact that Jesus is saying, well, if you look to what I'm going to do with Lazarus, you will see, I'm going to raise Lazarus. But then he says, whoever believes in me will never die. But he's about to die. And, whoever lives and believes in me will never die. And he knew he was only hours away from dying anyway. So the irony is the living and the dying. You watch what I'm going to do and believe in me, not watch my death and believe in me. It's very ironic that he's talking about life when he's facing death.
And of course, they're the two important symbols in this story. We're contrasting life and death, and John's having a lovely play with words. There is one other piece of irony in there, though. Did anyone spot it?
Is that about Jesus shouting commandingly to Lazarus in the same way that the crowds say to the Jewish authorities and to the Roman authorities? They shout, "We want Barabbas, crucify him." That command.
Right. It's exactly the same verb. So Jesus cries out to bring life, and the crowd cries out to bring death. And that's also irony that John has set up there with this contrast between the symbols of life and death. Who knew so much would be packed into one story?
Well, it is a long story, so you've got to expect a lot in it.
Yes. And what about, so we've mentioned life and death as symbols in this story. Are there other ones that anyone identified?
I've got a question about verse 11.
Yeah.
In the message, it says, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep. I'm going to wake him up.
Yeah.
I was wondered if there was, in the Greek, if there was a double meaning behind the Greek word that they use for fallen asleep.
Yeah, it's the standard Greek word koima, to fall asleep, but we find not only here but in various places that falling asleep and being dead are synonyms. They're words. So
can I ask John, Is it in the perfect?
Yes.
Here we
No,
go,
it's
Rick.
koimeto. Yeah, sorry, it is ke koimeto.
That's
Yes,
what
it
I
is
thought.
perfect
That
passage.
is significant.
Yeah.
It's in the perfect, and the perfect in Greek, because tenses mean stuff in Greek. The perfect in Greek means a single action with ongoing consequences. So that's an unusual tense for John to put it in the perfect. But of course, Lazarus falling asleep is going to have ongoing consequences because Jesus is going to go and wake him up, as it were.
So there is also a bit of an element of this light, the seeing, the light being a place of seeing, and darkness, because it all happens with Lazarus. He's in the darkness and everybody is seeing him come to life. So there's still a play on this light and dark themes that are running through John's stories.
Yeah, I think that's right, because he's in the dark of the tomb and he comes out into the light.
To the light.
Just to go back to the sleep bit for a minute, I thought it was somewhere there, but in 1 Thessalonians 4, the end of 1 Thessalonians 4, Paul talks about those who are still alive will rise up in the air room and will meet those who have died and will meet the Lord in the air. And then he goes on in chapter 5 and he uses that same play. Let us not fall asleep as others do, but let us keep awake and be sober. And then a little bit later, we obtain salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us. So whether we're awake or asleep, we may live with him. So the play is there, whether you're awake or asleep, whether you're alert or dopey, but also whether you're alive or dead. So it is a standard play on words. Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
And there's also in verse 9, he says to the disciples again, whoever walks in the day doesn't stumble because they see the light of the word.
Yes.
So that's that ongoing light day.
Yes.
Yeah, and of course we've got this shadowing what's going to happen to Jesus itself as another literary thing that's happening in this story as well. Is there anything else that people noticed? Or shall we move on and have a look at Jesus' emotions? I set you some homework. Did anyone actually have a look at this passage and pick up that there was a number of different translations around what happens when Jesus finally arrives at the tomb?
Yep.
A
little bit.
A little bit. So for this particular verse, which is in 1133, the NRSV says, when Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who came with her also weeping, that's the people consoling them, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. So who has different translations in their Bible other than greatly disturbed and deeply moved?
Yeah. Oh, just a minute. What verse is that?
It's verses, it's 1133.
33. Mine says he was troubled. He was deeply moved in spirit and troubled.
Okay. So we've got greatly disturbed and deeply moved, and we've got deeply moved and troubled. Any other advances? What does other people's Bibles say?
But the message says, when Jesus saw her sobbing and the Jews with her sobbing, a deep anger welled up within him.
I don't believe the message is the one that's actually got the closest to the translation.
Yes.
And the roof is still on. I do not believe this. This is an absolutely unprecedented event.
Well, that saves the message for a little bit anyway.
Yeah, the message is saved because the message is actually more bang on the money than the other ones are. Anyone else got a different translation that they want to share?
Someone else I was talking to recently, it was depressed. I've never read that before, but it had depressed.
No, that's not good. I'll put that one in the bin, Margot.
The Common English says deeply disturbed and troubled.
Yeah.
The NIV says deeply disturbed and troubled.
Yes.
When you find a number of things translating a passage, you can probably think that there's something going on with the Greek. And John has very kindly put up some different translations for you.
I like Tyndale. He groaned in his spirit and was troubled in himself.
Yes. So we have greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved in spirit and troubled. His heart was touched and deeply moved. A deep anger swelled up within him, and he was deeply troubled. And with the message, a deep anger welled up within him, and then he became enraged in the spirit and stirred himself up in the Jubilee Bible. That's interesting. And of course, Tyndale's, he groaned in yea spirit and was troubled in himself. So when you see all of these things here, you can assume we're dealing with two difficult Greek words. Now, I've probably given it away by lauding that the message finally got something right after years of getting things wrong. But probably the closest to this, I would say, is the NLT. A deep anger welled up within him and he was deeply troubled. So it's a Greek word that's a favourite word of mine, the first one that's been translated disturbed or moved or heart touched. You can put that one in the bin too, because that's not right. It literally means to snort like a horse. And it's the sort of noise that horses make when they're distressed or they're angry. And so it's a very full-blooded reaction. It's this loud, rumbling, shocking thing emanating from deep inside Jesus, because that's where the emotions were meant to be, like in your guts. The Old Testament often talks about, this thing in your guts, that's where you feel, which comes out of Jesus. And it's... we don't translate it that Jesus snorted like a horse, because that's really not going to mean anything else. But it does seem to mean some sort of deep burning anger. So Jesus is moved, but probably not in the way your translation would indicate.
I wonder
So
if
he's
he was
not
angry
happy.
with them.
Well, we're going to get to that.
Oh, sorry.
We're not jumping the gun yet, Judy. So what was he angry about? Yes, that's a good question, but we will get to that. Now, the second word that we're dealing with is also slightly difficult in the Greek, because it's often translated as troubled or moved, but it's a shudder. So it's this physical shudder. So he's shouting, he's making strange noises, and he's physically shuddering. And it shows that there's this real emotional turmoil raging in Jesus. And you could say he is shaking with anger. One commentator writes it implies a deep disturbance. Another wrote it's an expression of rage, to be indignant. Indignant's a good word here, I think. Another says Jesus is angry. So before we move on to why you think Jesus is angry, we want to have a look at what do you think the Bible translators are up to altering the meaning of these two words? And we might do this in the big group. So why have the translators toned down the meaning of these two very visceral, loud, physically engaged words? Anyone got a theory?
He's supposed to be loving and peaceful, isn't he?
Ah, yes, Jesus must be loving and peaceful.
He's on top.
You can't have a real man who gets really angry and upset about something.
Yes, that's a good point, Margaret. When we talk about Jesus being fully human, we only half mean it, don't we? Because we don't want to see Jesus experiencing and showing the full gamut of human emotion, which you'd expect a fully human man to do.
That's
so
right.
we like a peaceful Jesus, and we like one that's not really fully human. We like one that has got a range of emotions about this big and doesn't stray into some of these other feelings that's being demonstrated here.
And I
Any
think
other
that's
advances? Margaret?
Oh, it's just that I think Jesus has been tamed so much over the years. Yes, we lose that humanity, and it's a shame, because we need to know that the Saviour is someone who knows what it is like to be fully human. Not just knows it, but can experience it. I came to that conclusion a long time ago. So,
Yes, and nothing is ever what it seems in John. I keep telling you this. You've always got to look beneath the surface of John. Any other things about why the translators have altered it? I think you've nailed it pretty well with those comments.
More so like, what is John's point?
Yes, what is John's point? That's a good question, Bill. We'll get to that.
Good.
So now you know the more accurate meaning of these two unusual Greek words, changing and knowing what it really says, does that change the interpretation of the passage for you and the understanding of what Jesus is actually saying?
It has to.
It has to, Margot. In what way does it change it for you?
More about his humanity and his emotions.
Yes, we get to see a Jesus really expressing an emotion we don't normally see.
Could it be that here is the human Jesus facing death in reality here and knowing, you know, the full implications of that, yet here, knowing also what's going to happen to him and the anger and the frustration that's within him as he faces this, and he's the only one who can do anything about it. I don't know, just a thought.
Yeah, I think that has merit, that thought.
I find myself wondering, given what you were saying, Elizabeth, whether shuddered with deep emotion might actually be a better translation than naming the emotion as anger.
I'm going to name it as anger because we're about to get to another unusual Greek word that says it's anger.
Okay, fine.
Didn't he show his anger when he went to the temple and got rid of all those people? He was
Yes,
angry.
he was there.
Yeah.
He was angry then, especially in John. He makes a whip of cords in the Gospel of John and lashes people.
Yeah.
So yes, he gets very angry in the Gospel of John, probably more angry than John than he's getting anywhere else. So, and to talk about what Judy just said, that second verb usually does have anger accompanying it when it's translated, but we have another unusual Greek word about Jesus wept. And you'll see it's probably just translated in your Bible as Jesus weeps. And you might think to yourself, oh, isn't that nice? Jesus is also weeping along with the mourners. If that is, because that is what the translation is suggesting, you would agree?
No,
No?
I think Jesus is weeping with fury.
Yes, he is. And if you've read John's notes, you'd probably know that. It's an unusual Greek word. It's not the word used to describe the weeping of the band of mourners or the weeping of Mary and Martha, which is the crying of those in grief. Jesus is dakruo, which is what we call a hapax legomena. That means it only occurs once in the entire New Testament. And here it is here in John. And it's what Jesus is shedding tears, but Jesus isn't using that standard word. He's using this strange word that only occurs here, and it means to weep with anger.
Yeah.
So
why is he angry?
This is the question. Why is Jesus? Well, we've already learned that he's making noises and he's shuddering and he's probably not a happy chappy. And then we find this unusual word, dakruo, which is weeping with anger.
So were the translators worried that it looks like Jesus is getting angry at the mourners? Is that what they're worrying about?
Yeah, I think that we want to have gentle Jesus, meek and mild, crying for the death of his friend alongside Martha and Mary, don't we? Is that what we've kind of been led to expect in this story?
Elizabeth, what
in the traditional reading?
Hang on a minute, one at a time. Sherry, then Ian.
I agree with you in the traditional, the way we've been taught to read it without reading it critically.
Yeah, that's right. That's how we're taught. Ian.
Elizabeth, can you tell us what this mysterious Greek word is?
I did. I've said it about 4 times. It is dakruo.
The verse is in Greek is edakrusen hoiesis. And it's famous because it's regarded as the shortest verse in the Bible, because in English it's only 2 words, Jesus wept, but in Greek it's actually 3.
Yes.
Yeah, but so dakruo. there's no English connection with the word, like, some Greek words we take across into English, but
Yeah. So and the other Greek word is plaiousin.
Plaiousin, yeah.
Yeah, which is the normal kind of weeping that we get. I'll just mute Otto. Okay, so what happens directly before Jesus starts to weep? What happens directly before it?
Well, he was very disturbed, wasn't he?
Very disturbed.
Do you think he realizes that they're demanding these things of him, and he knows he's got very limited time, and it's almost as if they're saying to him, well, do this first, do this first.
I'm not sure that's exactly why he's angry. If we have a look at the verses, come down from 28. So we've had Martha say, if you'd have been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Then Mary comes out and says, if you'd have been here, my brother wouldn't have died. There's a whole pile of people with Mary and Martha mourning with them about the death. And they come to the tomb following Mary, and she says, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. How much faith are they showing in what Jesus has tried to tell them?
But they're not showing faith at all, really.
Exactly. This is the problem.
And
Like
even
typical of the Gospel of John, they don't understand what Jesus is indicating to them he's going to do. The disciples don't understand, because Thomas says, we'll go and die with him. He doesn't get what Jesus is saying. And Mary and Martha and the weeping people do not understand. And Jesus weeps and makes noises and shudders in frustration.
Because he knows he's only got limited time. And here are these people just...
I don't think it's the limited time so much here. It's more they don't get it.
Well, they haven't got time to get it. That's his theory, I think. I mean, they've had plenty of time, but they still haven't got it. They still don't understand.
And we know that too, because then it follows on from there. Some of them said, see how he loved him. And the Jews, of course, get it wrong. You expect that in the Gospel of John. And then some said, could not he have opened the eye? He who opened the eyes of the blind man kept this man from dying. And then again, we have that word, embramai. Jesus is again really disturbed after that comment.
Yeah.
So it seems to be John has ramped up his misunderstanding narratives. And he's ramped it up to the point that Jesus is now starting to get really angry when people don't understand who he is and what he's about to do.
Well, that's typical of humans, isn't it?
Of course it is. Of course it is. So John has constructed this, I guess. This is the seventh sign, and there's this really heightened emotion around the seventh sign for everybody. So, Judy, does that answer your question about why Jesus would be angry?
Yes.
Thank you.
So there's the big irony, isn't it? Is the blindness of everybody who was there to what has happened previously.
Yes. So we also have blindness and seeing going on in this story, though it's a little bit more subtle. People just don't get it. They don't see. They don't see who Jesus is and what's happening.
And Martha and Mary and Lazarus, Jesus knows them, whereas this woman at the well and the blind man, they're strangers. Yeah, it's people who know him, and he's just so cross.
He is very cross.
Intensified, yeah.
That's a really good point, I think, that these two very special people in his life are still blind.
Yeah. So are we surprised by Jesus' a sudden emotional outburst?
No, I'm not surprised.
It's probably a very different reading of this gospel story than what you are used to.
Yes.
But that's because that is not your fault. We're going to blame that squarely on translators who don't like to actually grapple sometimes with what is there.
It's interesting you say that, because I decided to dig deep into my library and found William Barclay's commentary on this. And he goes into a great deal on this word about Jesus being angry, not being just nicely troubled, and points out that really does change the whole interpretation or the way we understand the story.
Yes, and William Barclay is not always right, but he's right about that.
He's right about this one anyway.
Yes, he is. That's quite correct. So it's a different way of reading it. And when you understand what's actually going on, it puts a whole different meaning across these interactions and what's happening. And we have, again, a typical Johannine misunderstanding. And Jesus doesn't reply with a theological statement, as he normally would do when there's a misunderstanding in the Gospel of John. His reply is actually calling Lazarus out of the tomb.
Elizabeth.
Yes, Otto.
Can I just ask a little question? If I heard you correctly, you said that Jesus is angry because two people who are so close to him still do not understand? Or?
Yeah.
So you're saying, it's just that because in our small discussion group, we thought that Mary and Martha believed when they first met up with Jesus, first Martha and then Mary. So I'm hearing that he's saying that Jesus was angry because two of his closest friends still don't understand and disbelieve in him.
I don't think it's just his closest friends. You've got a whole pack of people that John calls the Jews there, or the Judaoi. They don't understand either, and we know they don't because they ask these questions. Could he not have opened the eyes, he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? He's questioning. And some of them said, look how he loved him. They're completely misunderstanding Jesus' tears at this point. But I don't think it's because Martha and Mary, even though Martha has said, you are the Son of God, they're not quite at the point in believing Jesus is the life and the resurrection and can bring life to their dead brother.
They're not quite.
They're not quite there yet.
Thank
and
you.
I think coupled with the crowd who are doing all this mourning for this man who's about to come back to life, Jesus gets very cross.
Because the crowd doesn't have the faith in him that he thought they would have.
No, and when he cries out loud, we know the crowd also uses that term, but he cries out to bring life to Lazarus. They cry out to bring death to Jesus.
Thank you.
So there's this really nice literary irony that John has set up here.
Elizabeth, I have a question too. We keep saying Mary and Martha didn't get it. The brother is dead. If they got it, how would they have responded?
Well, exactly. I mean, I don't know that we can push that too far because as far as the author of the Gospel of John is concerned, Kumar, no one can really get it. So Jesus can then explain by doing his big miracle. If you see what I'm saying, in a literary sense, if they'd understood it, then the story would be told quite differently.
But in a human sense, somebody caught immediately in grief, we don't necessarily expect people in that situation to think clearly and to
they don't think rationally.
Yeah, I mean it's the surge of emotion in Mary and Martha leads them, and Jesus, John is portraying them in a natural human way.
Well, he's also portraying Jesus in a natural human way too. Absolutely. Everyone's frustrated. Martha and Mary are saying, you should have been here or our brother wouldn't have died. Jesus is thinking, and you should understand that I'm about to do this stuff for your brother and bring him back. And, you know, I'm cross that you're not getting that. So they're spliced together in a way that creates this literary tension, if you like.
It's interesting. Just comparing this gospel, how John tries to smooth the story, but comparing to Matthew 15 and Mark 7, the Syrophoenician story, where Jesus said to the woman is a dog.
Yeah.
So So it is the translator who tried to smooth the story and not Jesus.
Yes, yes. It's not the author of the Gospel of John. It's the way it's translated that changes the way we read the story and alters what's actually going on. And I think the author of the Gospel of John would be quite cross about that, really, because he wants to make a point, and you miss the point if you actually tone down all of these really strong emotions and expressions of it.
The writer of John would be snorting like a horse, I think.
Yes, he would. The writer of John would be snorting like a horse. The only other gospel, the only other time Jesus snorts like a horse and uses that verb embramomai is in the Gospel of Mark, when he heals the deaf and the blind and the mute man. And he utters he follows the formula of the magic papyrus, and part of that is making a very strange sound. And it's having snorted like a horse, Jesus sends him away. So that's the strange sound that he makes during that particular healing. It's often translated as Jesus straightly charged, the King James Version, or Jesus sternly ordered him not to tell anyone. That is not what it says. It says literally, Jesus, having snorted like a horse, sent him on his way.
Isn't derision like snorting like a horse?
No. It's a magic sound.
Oh, okay, right.
But it can be associated with anger. So that's why you probably have straightly charged, or Jesus angrily ordered him to stay silent, which doesn't quite make sense. But if you understand it's part of the healing to make this sound, you finish off your healing by snorting like a horse. It makes far more sense, but it's never translated like that. So you don't get that sense in that miracle.
Because we wouldn't possibly want to put magic in Jesus's.
No.
Yeah.
Jesus in Mark in that healing follows the whole magical formula. He takes him aside, he touches him, he uses spittle, he looks up to heaven, he says a foreign word, epaphra, he snorts like a horse. It's all there in that particular one, and Luke and Matthew know it because they don't tell it the same way as Mark. They take out those magic things.
It's interesting. I've just looked at our Tongan translation for verse 23. We translate it as if Jesus has had a fit.
Yep. Well, he has
convulsion.
A convulsion.
Yep.
Yeah.
So yes, they're very, very strong Greek words, and your translations will mostly dumb them down. Kudos to the message. I don't normally say that, Sherry, but it got it right today.
One closing theological observation then about this story. It's a story about someone on the edge of life, on the edge of death, perhaps into death, being brought into life. And interestingly, the narrative doesn't actually say, it doesn't actually say Jesus raised Lazarus. It says they took away the stone. Jesus prayed, cried to Lazarus to come out. And then when he came out, he said, unbind him and let him go. And this is quite a climactic moment. As we've indicated, it's the seventh sign. It's the climactic moment in the plot. It's also theologically quite climactic in John's gospel, because Jesus here in this story has said, I am the resurrection and the life. And the resurrection points forward, of course, from that moment of bringing Lazarus to life, back to life, points forward to Jesus' own death and then resurrection. And I am the life is a very strong symbol in John's gospel, and in your resource material, you have a number of references going right back to the prologue, where in verse 4, the writer says, in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. And of course, the most famous verse in John's gospel is John 3:16, God so loved the world. And that ends by talking about everyone who believes in him may not perish, but may have eternal life. And then we find, throughout in chapters 4, 5, 6, 10, 11, on into 12, 14, I am the way, the truth, and the life, 17, and right at the end, that life is is referred to. In fact, that last reference, 20:31, the author says, these things are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is Messiah, Son of God, and through believing you may have life in his name. So that's a really important purpose in John's writing. And this story is a dramatic working out of that claim that Jesus comes to call people into life, which is a really nice theological moment to end with, I think. Next week, we stay with Jesus in Bethany and Jerusalem, and we're looking at the meal that Jesus shares with the back to life Lazarus and his sisters in Bethany, and then the way Jesus enters Jerusalem, and that will lead us into the story that we remember each Sunday on Palm Sunday. And then we'll just conclude chapter 12 by looking a little at some of Jesus' sayings later in that chapter. So that's the session for next week.